Hello again, and welcome back to Educator.com's Advanced PHP with MySQL course. In today's lesson, we're going to be introducing the concept of exceptions, which is basically an object-oriented way of error handling. We're going to introduce kind of what are new structures within PHP code. We're going to be introducing what are known as try-catch blocks, and they're blocks that work in pairs to be able to handle errors in your code. We're going to talk about a built-in class to PHP called the exception class, which is used to encompass an error. It's a class that essentially represents an error that's occurred. And then we're going to talk about a concept that'll be made clear as we go through it, known as rethrowing exceptions. So basically, PHP provides a way to more gracefully handle errors. Right now, the way we've been doing code is you can suppress the error using the at operator, and then maybe output a message on your own. Or if you don't catch the error, PHP will just output a very sort of terse, ugly error. Well, what PHP does is it provides provides functionality called try-catch blocks. And basically, what a try block is it's a section of code that you enclose within curly braces. And when you encounter an error condition within your code, for example, you try to open a file and you get an error, instead of just outputting an error message there, what you can do is it's called throwing an exception. And what it is, it's basically signaling to the code that an error has occurred. And what you do is you use the keyword throw, and then what you do is you pass it a new instance of the exception class, which you don't have to include the definition for in your PHP files. It's built into PHP, which typically contains an error message that you're going to include. And then we're going to see in a second that there is a catch block associated with this that is able to handle these different errors. So let's take a look at that actually. When an exception is thrown, as soon as an exception is thrown, you encounter an error, you throw an error, the code in that try block stops. So for example, if we were executing some code along here in the try block, we encountered an error and we threw this exception. Any code that was down here no longer gets executed. Instead, what happens is execution resumes down here to a catch block. A catch block basically says if an exception object that's of type exception has been thrown, and here we're throwing an object of type exception. Now the reason you can actually catch other types of exceptions, and that involves inheritance, which is a little more advanced object-oriented concept that we're not getting into in this course, but basically what the catch block does is you can assign it to catch different types of exceptions. In this case, we're just going to have it catch the generic exception class that's provided by PHP. So basically, we have some code along here, an error occurred, we throw an exception and set the error message for this exception object to error. What's going to happen is code's immediately going to stop, nothing around here is going to get executed, it's going to go to the catch statement, it's going to test if the exception thrown was of the type exception class, whose class type was type exception. Because it was, this is going to match. So basically what it's going to do is it's going to assign it to a value E, and then it's going to execute a section of code. So basically what this gives you the opportunity to do is when that error is thrown, you can catch it and perform whatever sort of error handling you want to do. In this particular case, as we'll learn about, you're actually just going to be outputting an error message. So let's actually take a look at a basic try-catch block. Here we have just a regular section of PHP code with a try statement. And actually, we're not even testing for an error. We're just, to demonstrate the concept, we're just throwing an exception. We're throwing a new instance of the exception class. We're not even passing it any parameters, which is something you can do. We have an associated catch block with this try block that's going to say if an exception is thrown up here, go ahead and catch it, and then execute the code within these curly braces. In this case, all we're going to do is output an error message that says an exception has been caught. So, and because this throw always occurs, this is always going to execute. It's not conditional. Typically, you'd have some if statement that would say if this condition fails, then throw the exception. In this particular example, we're just throwing it automatically to demonstrate. So let's take a look at the example. And we can see an exception has been caught. So basically what happened was PHP ran this code, it got to this line, it says, okay, an error's this signals an error. I'm throwing an error. I'm stopping any code. And then I'm going to go down here and process whatever error handling code is associated with that exception. Now, one thing that to notice is, let's say down here we had an echo statement, hello after. We're going to call it hello before. So we have a statement before we throw the exception and a statement afterward, an echo statement afterwards. Now, when you throw an exception, execution immediately stops in that code. So this line is not going to get executed. So if we go and run this code, all we're going to see output is this hello before, and then along with our exception here. Let's just put a break in there. So when we rerun our script, we're going to see hello before, but we don't see hello after, and that's because as soon as the throw occurs, execution of the statements in the try block stops, and it's going to say an exception has been caught. So basically, when an exception is caught, it's assigned to a variable that you can access within the curly braces. We saw in the last example that it actually looks like this. And here you can define this in your code, whatever value you want. And basically what that says is this is going to catch any exceptions that are thrown within its associated try block, and then it's going to assign the exception that it catches to this variable here that you declare. In this case, we declared it E. So if we wanted to access the different properties and methods of this exception object, which we're going to talk about in a second, you would do it using this E method. For example, E get message, which outputs its error message, or gets its error message. And so in these catch blocks, this is typically where your error handling occurs and allows you to sort of gracefully exit rather than just having some, terse PHP error statement going out to your users. So the exception class has a constructor that can take up to 3 optional parameters, the first of which is an error message to associate with the exception object. And then there are a couple of different methods that the exception class provides. The first one we're going to talk about is get message, and that basically does is if you set an error message when you create the exception object, when you pass an error message as the first parameter to the constructor, when you call this get message on that instance, so within our catch block, if we called it on E, for example, if that's the value we assign to the exception we're catching, if we call E get message, it's going to output whatever message we pass in the constructor to exception when we threw the exception. There's also a get file function that's an instance method of exception, so we would call it E get file, and that basically outputs the file where the error occurred. And then they have this similar function get line, which tells you the line where an error occurred. So if we take a look at an example called file error.php, we're going to try to open a file called temp.txt, and it's a file that let me just actually double check to make sure that doesn't exist. And the file doesn't exist, and when you try to open a file in read-only mode, it doesn't try to create the file if it doesn't exist. So when we try to open it, it's going to throw an error. So we have our error suppression operator here that's going to suppress the error, and then we can test open to see if an error occurred. If it returns false, then that way we know we had an error. So we're going to enter this if statement, this conditional statement, and what we're going to say is we're going to throw an exception. We're going to throw a new exception that has an error message. There was an error opening the file. What's going to happen, excuse me, is it's going to get caught. As soon as this is thrown, execution of the code jumps down here to the catch statement. It's going to catch the exception because it's of the exception class. It's going to assign it to the variable E, and then it's going to execute the code within these curly braces. So what we do here is we're simply taking this exception object that was caught. We're calling the instance method get message on it. We're outputting the message, which is this error message we included in the constructor. And then we're also making use of the getLine and getFile instant methods of the exception class to output where the line and the error occurred. So for example, if we go ahead and run this file, run the script, we're going to see there is an error opening the file. Error occurred on line 27 of, and then it lists the name of the file where the error occurred. And that again is because this file doesn't exist, and when you try to open something in read mode, it doesn't try and create the file, so it's going to generate an error. Let's say instead we try to open it in overwrite mode, oops, which automatically creates the file if it doesn't exist. Then this isn't going to throw an error, and so now when we run this file, we should see no output because open is going to be true, which is just going to evaluate to false, so this exception will never get thrown. And so actually, maybe we'll put like a little output message here after if statement, we'll say. So at least we have some output. And that's going to show that this if statement doesn't get executed, and then we output this message. Now the other thing to note also as well is once you reach the end of the try block, if you haven't thrown any errors, you don't execute any of the code within the catch blocks. What you would do at this point is, in this case, after we reach this echo statement down here, no exception was thrown, we jump over any catch box associated with it, and we begin executing the next line of code. So actually, maybe let's put another output statement here after catch block. So what we're going to see when we run this script is open is not going to cause an error, so we're not going to throw an exception. We're going to execute this next line in the try block. Then we're going to skip over the catch block because an exception wasn't thrown, and then we're going to echo any statements after that. In this case, it's going to say after catch block. So when we rerun our script now, we're going to say after if statement, after catch block. And so you can see that the exception wasn't thrown because there wasn't an error anymore, and then you can see how that the try block continues to execute after a throw statement, if the throw statement never gets executed, and then also that after you complete all the statements in a try block, you simply jump down to here. You notice that none of these lines got executed in here. We didn't have anything that said an error occurred. That's because an exception didn't occur, so or an exception wasn't caught. So if you never throw an exception, the code in the catch blocks never gets executed. So one other example is catching. You can actually catch. You can actually throw exceptions from methods as well. Like in this case, in our case, we've just been throwing them from a high, a first-level PHP script. Well, you can also do it, for example, from object methods. So here's sort of a stripped-down version of the data file class we've been using in our web application. That has an access mode, a file name, and then a file handle. You pass into the constructor the name of the file you want to open, the access mode you want to access it as, and then we define an open function. And the open function tests that the file name is valid, and then it attempts to open the file. If it does, it returns true, and the file handle gets set. The file handle property of this class gets set to whatever, to the handle of the open file. Now, if fopen returns an error, what we're going to do is set file handle to null, and we're actually going to use an exception. And we're going to throw an exception that says there was an error opening the data file. And so what's going to happen is that gets thrown. There's no catch block here, so what it does is instead of, it basically jumps to the end of this method and throws the exception to wherever this function was called from. So if we have a script where we create a new data file object and we try to open it, and this open method is called within a try block, this open method, because it throws an exception that doesn't get caught, we're going to catch it. It's going to be caught here because we have a catch block, and then we're going to be able to output the error message. The other thing is, for example, let's say the file name it's not a valid file name. Well, that's also going to be an error. So down here we can throw an exception with a different error message saying instance variable file name needs to be set because when the file name wasn't properly set when creating this. So here's a way that we can use this high-level script, the level script that calls this, to be able to output two different error messages depending on which exception occurs, and we do that simply by setting a different value of the error message for our exception object. So for example, if we try to open a data file and we pass it the file name null, what's going to happen is when we try to open it, it's going to cause an error because it's going to test if file name is not equal to null. It's going to turn out false. And so what's going to happen is it's going to execute this else statement, which is going to throw an exception. So if we go and run this class, run this script, we can see the error message in the open function of datafile.php. The instance file variable file name needs to be set. So this is a way you can provide useful also information to maybe your users, or also when you're debugging and stuff like that, to figure out where things are going. If we just put error, it's not as informative. So I always encourage you to, when you do throw exceptions and you do create error messages, to make them as useful and as meaningful as possible so you can really figure out what's going on. Now that's opposed to, let's say instead, oops, that we pass it a valid file name, temp.txt, but that doesn't exist, but we try to open it in read mode. And as we know that when we call open on a file in read mode that doesn't exist, it's going to throw an error. So our open method, it's going to enter this if statement because the file name is not equal to null. But when it tries to open the file, it's going to throw an error. So what's going to happen is this if statement is going to return false. We're going to exit the else block, which throws this other exception that says has a different error message that says there was an error opening the file. So if we go back and we save this and we reload our script, we can see we get a new error. There is an error opening the data file. So that's how you can see how a method can throw an exception that you can catch outside of the class. You don't actually have to catch it in whatever particular block it was defined in. If an exception is thrown within a method and there's no try-catch block, it'll get sort of thrown out to wherever that method was called from. In this case, in our script, exception from method.php. And here, because we have a try-catch block associated with it, we're able to catch it and then output the error message stored in the exception object. So one thing that you can also do is you can rethrow exceptions. That means that if you catch an exception, that instead of handling it and just outputting an error message, you can rethrow it. We just learned that you can throw you can throw an exception within a method, and if there's no catch block for it, it'll be caught in whatever script called it, assuming there was a try-catch block there. Well, what you can also do is if you have a method that has a try-catch block in it, it catches an exception, it can throw the error again, which is going to throw it to whatever method caught that. And then in that case, basically what you're doing is it's sort of like this chain of throws where you can pass it up to wherever you eventually want to handle it. So it's more easily understood if we look at an example. So let's say we have this data file class that we've created a new function in. It's the same as before, except we've created a new function called append line. And it's basically just to append a line to this data file. So in this append line function, the first thing we do is we try to open the data file represented by this class. So we call the object method open. Well, we do this within a try block because we know that this open method can throw an error, can throw an exception. So when we try to open this, in our example, we're going to try to open a file that, let's see what we do here. We try to open a file that doesn't exist, so it's going to throw an error. So what's going to happen is this is going to call this is open. This open is going to throw an error. Down here we have a catch block that's going to catch that exception, the exception thrown by the open method, and then instead of outputting an error message here, it's going to rethrow that. And simply what it does is you can say throw, and then you can pass it the object that represents that exception. And then what's going to happen is then whatever method called append line has the opportunity to catch that exception. So in our main script, what we do is we declare a new data file object that's going to end up causing an error when we try to call append line. And then within a try block, we call the append line method with hello world. And so what's going to happen is we're going to call append line. It's going to go into append line, and it's going to try to open the file, which is going to go up here. It's going to throw an error. It's going to encounter an error and throw an exception. We're going to catch the exception here instead of handling it here. Within the object code, we want to handle it, for example, in our script, because that's where we output stuff to the user. We rethrow it. We have a try-catch block where we called this append line, and so now this exception that was sort of like two function calls down that occurred and two function calls deeper, we catch it in our main script, and then we can output the error message. So when we try to append this line, we're going to get the error message that says, in this case, the file could not be opened because you can't open this file for reading because it doesn't exist. So if we go and try to run this run this script, we can see there is an error opening the data file. So we eventually called that method open by calling it within append line and open through the exception that append line caught, that rethrew it, that our main script caught, that was able to handle it. And what this allows you to do is sort of keep throwing errors sort of down the chain of method calls until you get to a spot where you want to be able to handle it. In this case, we didn't want to handle the error in this append line class. Let's say because it's typically we want to keep our output separate from our programming logic. So instead of outputting HTML here in this append line function that says there was an error thrown, we're just going to rethrow it up to our main script, which we use to output information to the user, and then we're going to output the error message there. So that's an example of what's known as rethrowing errors. Excuse me, rethrowing exceptions. So for the homework challenge, I want you to create a script that defines a function called divide, just a regular function, not a class function or anything. It takes two parameters that are numbers that are to be divided. And what it's going to do is it's going to test if the divisor parameter, which will have you be the second parameter. So the first parameter is going to be the dividend, the second parameter is going to be the divisor. It's going to test if it's equal to 0. If it's equal to 0, I want you to throw an exception using that exception class. So throw new exception, and then include an error message in the constructor of exception that says division by 0 was attempted. So that's if it's equal to 0. If the divisor is not equal to 0, then simply divide the dividend by the divisor and return the result. In the same script, after you define the function, instead of defining exception in a separate function library, you can just define it at the beginning of the script. For this simple example, go ahead and call divide twice, once with the numbers 10 and 5, so that's going to try to divide 10 by 5, and then try to call it a second time with 1 and 0. So it's going to try to divide 1 by 0, which is going to throw an exception. So call both these methods within a try block and associate a catch block with that try block that will catch an exception. And it's going to catch that divide by 0 exception, and what it's going to do is it's going to assign to a variable maybe $e, and then I want you to output the message that's associated with that exception. And that message that's going to be associated with it is what you set when you throw the exception originally when you call its constructor. And then when you run the script, you should verify that you see the output of 10 divided by 5 is going to equal 2. And then instead of seeing another output of 1 divided by 0, you should see your error handling code that says an exception has occurred, you tried to divide by 0. So that'll give you some experience with working with exception handling. So that ends today's lesson. Thank you for watching educator.com, and look forward to seeing you next time.